Wir kommen jetzt zu diesem Sitzungsteil des Untersuchungsausschusses des Europäischen Parlaments. Wir haben etwa eine Stunde für diesen Sitzungsteil und ich darf Sie zunächst bitten, uns Ihre Präsentation zu geben und nachher gibt es dann Fragen und Antworten. Ich freue mich sehr darüber, dass Sie heute hier bei uns sein können. Ich werde Ihnen das Wort erteilen, beziehungsweise der Videoverbindung dann es ermöglichen, dass Sie zu uns sprechen können. Ja, einen schönen guten Tag. Ich freue mich darüber, dass Sie diese Untersuchungen durchführen in Ihrem Ausschuss. Ich freue mich auch darüber, vor Ihnen sprechen zu dürfen. Es gab praktisch ja einen
important, but I think that the quantity of them has sometimes endangered the ultimate point from being obscured. And so I just wanted to spend a little bit of time.
Im Augenblick ist die Verdolmetschung leider nicht möglich.
Revelation, the crux of all of these stories that ties them together and that I think is the most important thing for us to realize. And that is what the ultimate goal of the NSA is, along with its most loyal, one might say subservient junior partner, the British agency GCHQ, when it comes to the reason why the system of suspicionless surveillance is being built. And the objective of this system is nothing less than the elimination of individual privacy worldwide. And at first glance, that might seem like it's a bit hyperbolic, like it's a little bit melodramatic, but it isn't. It's a literal description of what the NSA and its closest surveillance partners are attempting to achieve. And the reason that I know that that's what they're attempting to achieve is because this is what they say over and over and over again. On occasion, they say it publicly. And repeatedly they say it in their private documents, which were written when they thought nobody was able to hear what it was that they were saying. There are instances where Keith Alexander, the general who is the chief of the NSA, has made comments along the lines of the objective of the NSA is to collect all signals intelligence, all forms of electronic communication by and between human beings. And when this was first reported in The Guardian and elsewhere, the NSA tried to dismiss it as sort of a literary illusion or even a joke. It's no joke. Throughout the NSA documents, there appears continuously all sorts of references to the fact that the goal of the NSA is captured by the phrase collect it all. Whenever the U.S. and its four closest surveillance partners meet each year at a signals development conference, the four closest surveillance partners being the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, there are constant inclusions of slogans like collect it all or know it all or exploit it all throughout all of these documents. This is actually the mission of the NSA. And one of the ways that you see this mission manifest is that there are numerous programs that the NSA develops and pursues that have no real purpose other than to identify the few pockets of communication that still exist on the planet that the NSA hasn't yet quite successfully invaded. And the NSA is obsessed institutionally with the idea that there are still places and methods that exist that are impervious to their invasion, and they work every day to try and rectify what they see as this problem. The problem being that there are still places on the planet that human communication can take place without their collecting, storing, monitoring, and analyzing that communication. So there are documents devoted, for example, to trying to understand how better to invade the Wi-Fi systems on airplanes, based on the concern that human beings can still go on airplanes and use the internet or mobile phones for a few hours in their lives and not be susceptible to their surveillance net. There are documents that discuss ways to circumvent advanced encryption tools out of fear that individuals will develop the means to be able to communicate with one another privately without the NSA being able to invade those communications. And so what we're really faced with is not just the creation of the most pervasive system of suspicionless surveillance ever built in human history, although we certainly are faced with that. But it is beyond that. It is an institution that has embedded into its mandate the mission to ensure that human beings can no longer communicate with one another electronically with any degree of privacy. Simply through institutional inertia, there is an effort to collect everything. And over the past 6 months, I've done a lot of reporting in many different countries about espionage targeted at many different populations. And everywhere I do this reporting, I do interviews with newspapers or television programs in those countries. And I am always asked, why interest in Sweden? Why are they so interested in what people who are Swedes are discussing? Or why is the NSA obsessed with collecting all of the communications of Brazilians or any number of other countries? And the answer I always give is the answer that comes directly from the NSA's document, which is that the NSA and its Five Eyes partners don't need any specific reason to collect anybody's communications. Just the fact that human beings are communicating with one another is reason enough for the NSA to decide that it should be collected and stored and monitored. They don't need specific rationale. Their only rationale is that nobody should be able to communicate without the NSA's being able to invade the communication. And every one of the stories that we've done, every one of the specific stories, is driven by this overarching theme. And that's why I think it's fair to say that the significance of this reporting and of what Mr. Snowden revealed to the world really can't be overstated. If governments are devoted to the elimination of privacy worldwide, as the U.S., the U.K., and its three partners are clearly devoted to doing, that has profound consequences for everybody who communicates electronically, which is most people on the planet. And at the very least, it's something that we ought to be discussing and debating openly, if not figuring out how to stop. The second point I wanted to make is I wanted to discuss a little bit what some of the reaction has been to our reporting, especially in Europe, but also around the world, because I think it reveals a very important point. It was back in late June, so 5 months ago or so, that Der Spiegel first reported that the NSA was targeting ordinary Germans by the hundreds of millions for collection of the metadata of their telephone records. And the reaction of the German government was very muted. There were some symbolic gestures to objecting, but by and large it was very restrained, the reaction. There wasn't very much of an effort to really do anything about it. And it really wasn't until Der Spiegel was able to reveal that not only ordinary Germans, but even the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, was the target of this surveillance system, did the German government finally react with genuine indignation and decided that it needed to do something about it. And I think that's a pattern that has repeated itself in other countries as well, sort of apathy and indifference when it's revealed that the population is being targeted with mass surveillance, but true anger when governments find out that they themselves are targeted. And I think part of what explains that interesting dichotomy is the fact that political officials often tend to be concerned about their own interest and not the interests of the citizens whom they're ostensibly representing. But I think the broader point has been this idea that as long as the NSA is quote-unquote only collecting, then we can live with that level of intrusion. But when it comes to listening to people's cell phone calls or reading their emails, that's when genuine outrage is warranted. And I just want to spend a moment addressing this point, because I think it's probably the single greatest misconception in the reporting that we've been doing. If you talk to surveillance experts, as I know that you're doing, what you will hear, I think almost by consensus at this point around the world, is that metadata is not simply almost as invasive as content interception, or even as invasive. In most cases, in most meaningful senses, collection of metadata is now more invasive than collection of content. And it isn't just surveillance experts who think that way, it's the NSA itself. Throughout these documents appears the recognition that collecting metadata is the supreme priority of the agency, not because it protects people's privacy, but precisely because it enables the NSA to invade people's privacy more effectively than the interception of content. And I think sometimes it's difficult to understand that in the abstract, but it's easy to understand it when concrete examples are used. And so if you can imagine, for example, a woman who decides that she wants to get an abortion, if you're listening in on her phone call, what you will hear is her calling a clinic. The clinic will answer with a generic sounding name like Eastside Clinic or something like that. You will hear the woman who you've decided to target for surveillance ask for an appointment Tuesday at 2 o'clock, get an appointment Tuesday at 2 o'clock, and then hang up the phone, and you'll have no idea why she called or even what kind of clinic she called or what the purpose was. But if you're collecting her metadata, you will see the phone number that she called. You will then be able to identify it as an abortion clinic. You will know how many times she called that clinic, and you will have exactly the information that you wouldn't get if you were simply listening to her phone call. The same with somebody who has HIV and calls a doctor specializing in HIV once every 3 months, as HIV patients often do. If you're listening to their phone calls, you'll have no idea what kind of doctor they're calling, but if you're collecting their metadata, you'll know everything about their medical condition. The same with somebody who calls a suicide hotline or a drug addiction clinic, or somebody who is speaking with someone who is not their spouse late at night, or any number of other types of intimate activities that human beings engage in that you probably wouldn't be able to apprehend if you're reading their emails or listening to their telephone calls, but that you will instantly be able to understand by collecting their metadata. And then beyond that, there are very sophisticated, increasingly sophisticated tools for analyzing metadata when it's collected in mass, to be able to understand not only who your targets are speaking to, but who those people are speaking to, and then who those people, and to develop a very comprehensive picture of the network of associations and friends of various individuals, but also of the society generally, to have a very invasive understanding of the private behavior, the private associations, the private thoughts of the people under whom you place under surveillance by collection of metadata. It really is the case that if you're somebody who values privacy, it would almost be preferable at this point to have the NSA listening to your phone calls and reading your emails than it is for them to collect all of your metadata over the course of many years and be able to link it to everybody else's metadata and then analyze it in secret, virtually no restraints, as the NSA, the GCHQ, and its surveillance partners are doing. The third point I wanted to make and just talk about briefly is the of individual privacy. There's often this sense that I think Western governments have to inculcate people to accept that privacy doesn't really have much value, that it's essentially a luxury, that if you've done nothing wrong, you have nothing to hide, all the sorts of cliches that have been manufactured and then disseminated to get populations accustomed to an invasion of their privacy. And I think that although there's a perception that it's successful, I think in reality it can't work and hasn't worked because human beings instinctively understand why privacy actually is vital. That's why they put passwords on their email accounts and their social media networks. It's why they put locks on their bedroom and bathroom doors. It's why if you propose that you put video cameras in their homes to monitor everything they're doing to protect them from invaders or criminals, they would react with repulsion because human beings instinctively understand that privacy is a critical component of what it means to be a free human being. And I think, though, that it's worth just spending a minute to underscore why that is. And I think we all have this understanding that when we know that we are being watched by other people, when we know that other people are casting a judgmental examination upon our choices and our behavior is much different than when we act in a private realm. When we think other people are watching us, we make choices that conform to orthodoxies that are designed to avoid behavior deemed to be shameful. Essentially, we make choices to fulfill the expectations that other people in the broader society have of us. We become conformists. We conform to mores and norms. When we have a realm that we can go into where we're confident that we're not being watched, can we test boundaries? Can we engage in creativity and dissent? Can we violate orthodoxies? That is essentially the realm in which human freedom exclusively resides, when we can decide for ourselves what kind of choices we want to make. In a society in which the private realm is abolished, in which human beings know that they're susceptible to being watched at any time, and I think that's the key, not necessarily that every one of their emails is being read, but that their emails and telephone calls can be monitored by unseen agencies. Just the knowledge that your behavior is subjected to the possibility of surveillance is a society that breeds conformity. It's a society in which individuals will have the range of choices that are available to them severely constricted. And it's why every tyranny, every despot, every oppressive government loves a surveillance state, precisely because it eliminates human choice and breeds conformity and really severely reduces the amount of freedom that as individuals we have. And that's why I think that beyond the political implications or the theoretical and legal implications, there are very serious consequences for what it means to be a free individual, to live in a state like the one that we're moving to, in which the surveillance is both invisible and yet ubiquitous. The final point I wanted to make is that I began by saying that I'm glad that this committee has convened this inquiry and that we're able to have this opportunity to discuss all of these issues. And I just want to remind everybody that there's only one reason why we're able to have the discussion that we're having today, and why we have the knowledge and information that we now possess about this system. And that one reason is the brave and quite self-sacrificing decision of my source for this story, Edward Snowden, to risk everything in his life that he had, career stability and personal relationships and the ability to be a free citizen, in order to bring it to all of our attention. And there are governments all over the world, in fact most governments all over the world, who are extreme beneficiaries of Mr. Snowden's choice. Human beings all over the world consider him a hero. Governments have been able to realize how their privacy is being invaded, to take steps to reform the abuses that we now know about, to convene investigations like the one that we're here to participate in today. All sorts of people, all kinds of governments all over the world exploiting for their own interest and their own benefit the very brave sacrifice that Mr. Snowden made. And I'm glad to see that they're doing that, and I know that he is as well. Very gratified that governments are taking so seriously what it is that he has shown them. But what has happened is that although there are lots of governments who have taken advantage of the choice that he made and the sacrifice and bravery that he's shown, there are very, very few governments, in fact a tiny handful, who are extending a reciprocal courtesy to him of protecting his rights the way that he decided to protect all of ours. And because of that, he currently is in a situation that's very uncertain, where his own government is attempting to subject him to serious persecution, to put him in a cage for decades, if not the rest of his life, for having come forward and shown a light on much of this behavior that is illegal and certainly abusive. And yet most governments around the world have decided to turn their back not only on him but on their own obligations ethically and legally to protect people such as Mr. Snowden from persecution by granting them asylum. And I think it's a very strange and disappointing dynamic to watch governments in Europe express indignation over what he has revealed and to take steps to protect themselves against it, while at the same time turning their back on him and allowing his own government to threaten him with life in prison. And I would hope that governments around the world will not only decide to try and exploit his revelations for their own interests, but also to express gratitude for what it is that he did by protecting his basic human rights, which is the right to come forward with evidence of secret wrongdoing on the part of the world's most powerful factions and not be sent to prison for the rest of your life for having done it. So with that, I thank you once again very much for inviting me, and I'm happy to have a discussion with any of you who have questions.
Okay, thank you very much for.
Herzlichen Dank für diese Einführung. Jetzt kommen wir zu Fragen und Antworten. Ich hoffe, dass wir weiterhin eine stabile Verbindung zu Ihnen halten können. Wir werden unsere Sprachen sprechen. Sie bekommen die Verdolmetschung ins Englische. Aber die Ausführungen von Herrn Snowden konnten leider nicht verdolmetscht werden aufgrund von technischen Schwierigkeiten. Wir werden unsere Kollegen und unsere Gäste bitten, so kurz und wie möglich sich zu fassen, damit wir wirklich viele Fragen stellen können. Wir haben eine Frage, eine Antwort jeweils und ich werde alle bitten, sich sehr, sehr kurz zu fassen. Zunächst einmal der Berichterstatter, Herr Claude Moraes, S&D-Fraktion. Dankeschön, Herr Greenwald, dafür, dass Sie sich die Zeit genommen haben, heute hier bei uns zu sein. Ich dürfte vielleicht das aufgreifen, was Sie zum Schluss angesprochen haben, die Quelle sozusagen Edward Snowden. In meinem Bericht werde ich über den Schutz von Whistleblowern sprechen. Gestern haben wir einen Kongressausschuss von Herrn Rogers gesehen und da ist die Definition abgelehnt worden, dass Herr Snowden ein Whistleblower ist. Man hat gesagt, das stimmt so nicht. Wie sehen Sie das? Denn wenn diese Definition abgelehnt wird, dann sieht man ihn natürlich eher als Verräter. Und Ihre Frage, wie sehen Sie das? Wie geht es um die Folgen, die damit verknüpft sind? Und dann zweitens zu dem Urteil des Gerichtshofes. Dein Feinstein, der Kongressausschuss, andere haben auch gesagt, das ist eines von vielen Urteilen. Das ist für uns ein wichtigstes Urteil, auch für unseren Bericht, denn da kann man vielleicht zum ersten Mal jetzt diese gesamte Frage der Metadaten bestimmen, so wie Sie das auch beschrieben haben, dass das vielleicht dann doch auch wichtig ist, dass etwas passiert ist. Sie haben das Urteil begrüßt, aber jetzt gibt es Stimmen, die sagen, das ist eigentlich nicht so wichtig als Urteil. Was ist Ihre Auffassung dazu? Und dann zum Schluss der Guardian, der ja auch berichtet hat über Ihre Arbeit. Was sagen Sie zu der Kritik? Da wird gesagt, es werden Menschen gefährdet, das sei nicht angemessen. Ich verstehe das so, dass Sie alle möglichen Informationen abgeleitet haben. Aber wie reagieren Sie auf diese Kritik? Und dann letztlich die Aussprache im Europäischen Parlament zu der Frage von David Miranda. Ist das angemessen oder nicht? Vielleicht könnten Sie auch etwas dazu sagen. Also Terrorismusbekämpfung wurde ja auch in dem Zusammenhang angesprochen. Herr Greenwald.
I'll just take those in order. I think Mike Rogers picked a very bad week to deny that Mr. Snowden is a whistleblower, given the federal court decision that you referenced in the second part of your question, which is that the core program that was the first one that we revealed and that Mr. Snowden, when I first met with him, cited as what caused him to come forward, namely the collection of the metadata of all Americans without regard to suspicion or evidence of wrongdoing, that it violates the core guarantee of the United States Constitution, and the court said it isn't even really close. So somebody who comes forward and reveals a program that a federal court in the United States says violates the Constitution and is therefore illegal is the classic whistleblower. On top of the fact that his revelations have sparked a debate in the United States and around the world, as evidenced by the hearing that we're participating in today, about all sorts of things that I think everybody on all sides of the debate agrees we're better off knowing about. And that is a classic whistleblower, somebody who reveals to the public evidence of wrongdoing, as well as illegality, and that sparks very important debates that no democratic society can be without. And that is exactly what Mr. Snowden has done. It makes him the classic whistleblower. As far as the court opinion that you asked about, what generally happens in the United States when it comes to surveillance is the only courts that ever rule on these programs are courts that no Western democracy would even recognize as courts. They're tribunals that meet in secret and where only one side, namely the U.S. government, is permitted to be present and heard. What happened yesterday is the first time a real court proceeding has actually evaluated the legality of these surveillance programs. And the judge's opinion, which I really urge everybody around the world to read, it's not only about U.S. law, but it's about the way in which these programs destroy the concept of individual privacy and how the rationale offered by the U.S. government is false, namely that it helps terrorism. The judge said there's zero evidence that it has stopped terrorism. This opinion was issued by one of the most respected national security judges in the United States. He's not known as a liberal, quite the opposite. He's a conservative judge appointed by President Bush. And yet what he said is that the national security rationale offered by the government is not only false, but woefully inadequate to justify the very serious privacy infringements that the collection of metadata imposes on everybody who is subjected to it. And given the gravity of the opinion, how vehement it was, and the fact that it was issued by this judge, I think is quite vital. As far as the third question, which is responding to my critics, it's really remarkable because although we have been criticized with disclosing documents which put people in danger, I've actually been pretty vehemently criticized from the other direction as well, which is namely that we have published too few documents, that we've withheld too many, that we've gone too slow in how we publish these documents. And I actually consider that criticism to be vastly more persuasive and valid than the one that says that we put people in danger. Terrorists have long known that the U.S. and the U.K. governments and lots of other governments are doing everything possible to monitor their communications. Osama bin Laden famously used human couriers to communicate with his associates precisely because all terrorists already know that everything that they're doing on the internet or the telephones is subject to being monitored by various governments. We didn't tell terrorists anything that they didn't already know. What we told people that they didn't already know was that not the terrorists, but that they themselves, innocent people, are the real targets of this mass surveillance system. And we haven't harmed national security or put in danger anyone's lives. The only thing we've harmed is the perception of honesty and the credibility of Western leaders who have built this massive surveillance system in the dark. And then the final point about the case of my partner David Miranda, the one thing I want to say about that is I hope that everyone understands how extreme and radical the UK government is when it comes to press freedoms. They are literally equating the reporting that we've done not only with espionage, but with terrorism. The U.S. State Department has for years condemned as tyrannical governments that equate journalists with terrorists or journalism with terrorism. And that is exactly what the UK government is doing in this case. And they have lots of other instances where they threaten core press freedoms of The Guardian and of the journalists who have been able to report on this story in a way that I think any country that overlooks what the UK government is doing loses all credibility when it comes to denouncing attacks on press freedom when engaged in by countries that aren't quite as familiar or that are allies of those governments.
Okay, thank you. The next question.
Dankeschön. Die nächste Frage von Herrn Voss für die EVP-Fraktion.
And I would like to talk in German. So, vielen Dank, Herr Greenwald, für Ihre Zeit und für Ihre Möglichkeiten, uns hier auch zur Verfügung zu stehen. Ich habe eigentlich mehr oder weniger 3 kleine Fragen. Zum einen, wenn es ein ernsthaftes Anliegen ist, uns auf diese Situation und das das Hineingreifen in die Privatsphäre eigentlich global gesehen sein soll, dann frage ich mich im Moment, ist eigentlich alles schon bekannt, was wir wissen sollten? Oder ob dann noch was kommt an Informationen, von denen wir noch überrascht sein könnten, weil es für uns natürlich sehr wichtig wäre, was es vielleicht noch zusätzlich an Möglichkeiten gäbe. Dann hatten Sie Ausführungen gemacht, was man alles so abhören und mitbekommen kann. Ich frage mich nur im Moment, bislang sind doch eigentlich Dinge veröffentlicht worden, die immer im nationalen oder beziehungsweise im Interesse der nationalen Sicherheit lagen oder das Interesse überhaupt national da war, sodass ich mich frage, das Beispiel, was Sie genannt hatten, hinsichtlich der Möglichkeiten, eine Abtreibungsklinik anzurufen, ob das tatsächlich im Interesse der NSA ist, solche Informationen auszuwerten, dass es möglich ist, so etwas abzuhören oder zu kontrollieren, ist uns, glaube ich, mittlerweile allen bekannt. Aber ist es wirklich das Interesse, was da eine Rolle spielt? Und das Dritte wäre hinsichtlich der Bedrohungen. Wir haben natürlich die Bedrohung sozusagen der Privatsphäre, die uns hier im Moment sehr beschäftigt. Aber was ist mit den Bedrohungen, die es sozusagen auf dieser Welt gegen Staaten auch gibt? Nicht nur in der ganzen elektronischen Welt, auch über fundamentalistische Strömungen. Und ist es denn da nicht durchaus aus Ihrer Sicht gerechtfertigt, in bestimmte Aufklärungsarbeit auch zu leisten, selbst wenn das ein oder andere damit aufgefischt wird, was man eigentlich nicht auffischen sollte?
Thank you, Mr. Greenwald.
Dankeschön, Herr Greenwald.
For those questions, as far as we know, whether we know everything, we certainly know the gist of what these documents reveal, as I began by describing, that the NSA, the GCHQ, and allied governments are attempting to collect all forms of human electronic communication. There are still stories left that we are going to report that are significant. The documents are complicated, and as responsible journalists, it takes us a little bit of time to process them and report them accurately. So we're doing it as fast as we can, consistent with being responsible and accurate. So there definitely are still stories that remain that I think are significant, but certainly after 6 months, I think everybody gets the fundamental point that drove Mr. Snowden to come forward, which is the menace posed by the surveillance system to everybody's individual privacy. As far as the question about the NSA and whether it has an interest in, for example, collecting information about a woman getting an abortion or about people calling drug and alcohol clinics, I think to answer that question, all you have to do is look at recent history, not only in the United States, but in other countries as well. There is no instance where governments have developed the power to engage in secret, massive surveillance where it wasn't abused. For decades in the United States government used its surveillance authorities to monitor and eavesdrop on political dissidents and opponents of the government. The FBI famously tried to get evidence that Martin Luther King was having adulterous affairs and then threatened him or even tried to encourage him to commit suicide. There were decades of abuses that come from this system. I think it's widely understood that if human beings can exercise massive surveillance power in the dark with no accountability or transparency, that it's not likely but inevitable that it will be abused. And just 3 weeks ago, we reported that one of the things the NSA is doing is monitoring people not who are engaged in terrorist activities or are members of terrorist organizations, but who express what the U.S. government calls radical ideas, who have been targeted by the NSA, and the NSA is collecting information about their visits to pornographic sites or sexual chats that they have online with people who they're not married to. And the document we published contains plans to use that information to publicly humiliate and discredit those people to prevent them from effectively communicating their ideas to the world. A pure instance of abuse. So it may be true that the ordinary person who never challenges the government isn't going to be threatened with that kind of abuse because they're not challenging the government, but I don't think we want to create a society that says you won't be targeted with abusive surveillance as long as you just stay at home and mind your own business and never challenge the government. I think the measure of a free society is how it treats its dissidents and those who express ideas that deviate from the norm. Finally, on the issue of whether there's justifiable surveillance, I think the answer is of course there's justifiable surveillance. Everybody agrees that when there's evidence that somebody is engaged in terrorist organizations or terrorist plots, that their conversations can be legitimately monitored. I think it should happen in a framework of accountability and the involvement of courts to make sure that it's not being abused. But that's not what this evidence and the documents show. The documents show whole populations being subjected to mass indiscriminate surveillance. And if you look at some of the specific cases that we've reported on, such as the targeting by the U.S. and the GCHQ of Petrobras, the oil giant, or the Organization of American States, or economic conferences where economic accords are being negotiated in Latin America, or spying on energy companies, such as we've reported in Norway and Sweden, what a lot of this spying is about has nothing to do with terrorism or national security. That is the pretext. It is about diplomatic manipulation and economic advantage and essentially the accumulation of power. Terrorism and national security are the banners that are waved to excuse it, but not the real purpose. These documents leave no doubt about that.
Okay, thank you. I'm afraid I'm going to have to...
Dankeschön. Ich dürfte Sie vielleicht auch bitten, sich etwas kürzer zu fassen bei den Antworten. Ansonsten haben wir nicht genügend Zeit. Und jetzt setze ich mir einen anderen Hut auf und werde eine Frage stellen, Frage stellen für die liberal-demokratische Fraktion. Die verschiedensten Ziele, die aufgedeckt worden sind, da gibt es eins, was von besonderem Interesse ist, das Europäische Parlament, nämlich der Server von SWIFT. Da geht es um die Verarbeitung von Bankendaten. Und in dem Snowden-Papier gibt es Hinweise dafür, dass die US-Behörden einen nicht genehmigten Zugang haben oder zumindest die Möglichkeit haben, einen nicht berechtigten genehmigten Zugang zu haben. Haben Sie da weitere Informationen darüber? Dann die zweite Frage. Ein Whistleblower, das, was den Whistleblower ausmacht, ist, dass er sämtliche internen Verfahren ausgeschöpft hat, um eine falsche Vorgehensweise auch anprangern zu können. Ist das der Vorgang auch bei Herrn Snowden gewesen? Meine dritte Frage. In der Einführung haben Sie das Vereinigte Königreich herausgegriffen als einen Verbündeten der Vereinigten Staaten. Gibt es andere europäische Länder, die Sie auch noch ansprechen wollten? Und dann die Frage auch von Herrn Voss. Haben Sie Beweise oder Hinweise gegeben, dass Informationen genutzt worden sind gegen politische Gegner oder dass es auch genehmigt würde, explizit genehmigt würde, diese Hinweise gegen politische Gegner zu verwenden? Dankeschön.
As far as the SWIFT banking system is concerned, the New York Times reported 7 years ago that the NSA had targeted the SWIFT banking system. The document that we published in Brazil on the targeting of Petrobras by the NSA and the GCHQ listed as among its targets the SWIFT banking system as well. That's the reporting that we've done so far. So clearly SWIFT is part of the targets of the NSA and the GCHQ. As far as being a whistleblower and exhausting all of the internal procedures, I think Mr. Snowden has explained that in past jobs that he had, when he brought wrongdoing to light, he was dismissed by his supervisors and told to go back to work and mind his own business, the same response that other whistleblowers like Chelsea Manning have received. But I think the most important point there is that there are senators on the Intelligence Committee of the United States who were aware of this wrongdoing and were trying to warn the public about it, but were constrained by law from even telling the public what it is that they had found out and were essentially rendered impotent. And so Mr. Snowden saw that even United States senators, had he gone to them, were barred by law from speaking out about it or doing anything about it, and realized that his only recourse for making this public and getting action was to make it public, that the internal systems for whistleblowers is really a farce. It's an illusion. It's designed to suppress the information and not to bring it to light. As far as other European allies beyond the GCHQ, the UK, obviously the UK is the closest ally. There is another level of cooperation beyond the Five Eyes program, which the U.S. calls the Nine Eyes or Tier B cooperation, where these governments cooperate with the NSA on a case-by-case basis for specific targeting purposes. And Germany and France, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark are among the countries in Europe which participate most extensively with the NSA in these kinds of directed spying opportunity missions, and we publish documents setting that forth. And then finally, as far as the evidence of using this against political adversaries, I described the story that we published in the Huffington Post a couple of weeks ago in which the NSA plotted to use evidence of sexual activity on the internet in order to discredit and destroy the reputation of people that they consider to be purveyors of ideas they think are radical. There's a lot more reporting that we have to do on that question that I just can't talk about because the documents aren't yet published and the reporting isn't yet done.
Okay, thank you very much. Then the next question will be...
Dankeschön. Die nächste Frage von Herrn Kirkhope für die konservative Fraktion.
Sorry, no, inverse order. Mr.
Nein, wir stellen um Herr Albrecht für die Fraktion der Grünen und dann nachher Herr Kirkhope. Herzlichen Dank. Zunächst darf ich sagen, dass ich Ihnen danke für Ihre Arbeit. Denn ohne unabhängige Arbeit von Journalisten, die eine Prüfung dieser Dokumente vornehmen, darüber berichten, würden wir eine solche Aussprache gar nicht führen können. Ich möchte 3 Fragen stellen. Erstens, im Zusammenhang mit der Bewusstseinsbildung. Es gibt viele Politiker, die der Auffassung sind, dass es den Bürgern eigentlich egal ist. Wie sehen Sie das? Gibt es Ihres Erachtens Nachweise dafür, dass diese grundlegenden Fragen, dass dieses Thema auch eine Rolle spielen könnte in dem demokratischen Entscheidungsfindungsprozess, also auch bei Wahlen in den kommenden Jahren? Und dann eine zweite Frage im Zusammenhang mit der Ausspähungspolitik mit den Nachrichtendiensten im Zusammenhang. Haben Sie Hinweise dafür, dass es auch wirtschaftliche Interessen gibt, die bei dieser Spionagetätigkeit der Nachrichtendienste mit auch zu finden sind, zum Beispiel beim GCHQ, also Wirtschaftsspionage und entsprechende Interessen. Und dann drittens die Arbeit von Journalisten. Ich sagte das ja schon, ich bewundere die Arbeit von unabhängigen Journalisten, die diese Informationen prüfen. Ich habe von vielen Quellen gehört, nicht nur von Ihnen, dass die Arbeit der Journalisten und der freien Presse in Europa gefährdet ist. Und meine Frage in dem Zusammenhang wäre, inwieweit Sie Möglichkeiten für uns Politiker erkennen können, dass diese Arbeit der freien Presse in Europa und weltweit geschützt wird. Und ob Sie der Auffassung sind, dass Sie vor den Menschenrechtsgerichtshof vor Straßburg gehen bei dieser offensichtlichen Verletzung der Meinungsfreiheit und der freien Presse in Europa.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you for the kind words. And as far as the question of whether or not citizens care, there's immense anecdotal and also empirical evidence that demonstrates how much they do. I think around the world, literally millions of people have been engaged by this reporting, have concluded that Mr. Snowden is heroic for what it is that he did. The fact that here we are 6 months after the story began, and the interest level around the world is as high as ever, I think is a testament to that. In the U.S., there is very severe polling shifts in terms of people now for the first time since 9/11 viewing threats to their freedom and privacy from the government as being greater than the threat of terrorism, and all kinds of significant shifts in how people perceive these issues. And I think that continuing to make people aware of not only the severity of the threat, but the reason why it affects them so personally is instrumental to ensuring that people continue to take an interest in what governments are doing to their privacy. As far as the question of economic interest, as I indicated in my last response, there have been literally, I think, more than a dozen stories now about programs that have as their only goal spying on economic entities for economic reasons. Exactly what the U.S. and the West have criticized China very vocally for doing is what the U.S., the GCHQ, and its allies are continuously doing as well. And I think, again, I'm hesitant to talk about reporting that we've not yet done, but Europe is by no means exempt when it comes to the U.S. and the GCHQ, putting it under a surveillance microscope in terms of trade talks and other kinds of economic interests. And then finally, on the question of a free press, I think it's hard to overstate just how successful the effort has been to intimidate journalists and their sources by the UK and the US. I know I've received all kinds of invitations over the last 3 or 4 months to attend events and speak at events in Europe, at private events, at organizations, at public events before government bodies. and have been advised by all kinds of lawyers that traveling to Europe as a journalist would be very dangerous for me because of the charges that the UK government is threatening to bring as a result of the journalism that I've been doing. And that's true for other people who are serving and working as journalists on this story, and on other stories as well. And so I do hope that, to the extent that any of you believe that the information that has been revealed has been at all helpful in fulfilling your duties as legislators, that you take steps to protect the journalists and especially the sources who have sacrificed their own interests to bring it all to light.
Thank you. Then now it's the
Ja, danke schön. Jetzt hat Herr Kirkhope das Wort. Dankeschön, Frau Vorsitzende. Ja, schönen guten Morgen, Herr Greenwald. Ich nehme an, dass es früh morgens ist, dort, wo Sie sich befinden. Mir geht es mehr um die Prozesse, um die Verfahren, als um die allgemeinen Bemerkungen. Ich hätte nur gerne gewusst, ob bei den Informationen Sie eine vollständige Kopie der Dokumente von Herrn Snowden bekommen haben oder ob Sie das über einen Vermittler bekommen haben, zusätzliche Dokumente oder Kopien von der Guardian-Zeitung. Wenn es nicht Originale sind, haben Sie dann auch getrennte Kopien von anderen Quellen bekommen oder eine Mischung von beiden? Sie haben sehr viel über Dokumente gesprochen und was die beinhalten. Ich hätte da gerne noch etwas nachgehakt. Worum ging es denn bei diesen Dokumenten? Gab es da auch die Namen von Agenten vom Geheimdienst? In Ihrem Twitter-Konto haben Sie gesagt, dass es der Beschluss des Guardians war, die GSQ-Akte an die New York Times zu geben. Haben Sie dann später darüber erfahren oder haben Sie die gleich bekommen? Dann geht es um Informationen bezüglich Herrn Snowden. Einige sehen ihn als Held an. Ich kann dem nicht zustimmen. Aber wenn hier Bezug genommen wird auf den Whistleblower, die rechtlichen Verfahren in den Vereinigten Staaten haben einen klaren Leitfaden herausgegeben, wie Whistleblower sich verhalten. Es gibt auch Schutz für Whistleblowers in der amerikanischen Verfassung und im Rechtssystem. Wie kommt es denn, dass wir keine Belege dahingehend haben, dass Herr Snowden versucht hat, die rechtlichen Wege auszuschöpfen? Und praktisch sind wir dann in die Situation gelangt, dass er praktisch der Welt gesagt hat, was da geschieht. Ist das denn ein verantwortungsvolles Verhalten, wenn es so wichtig ist, die Sicherheit hier aufrechtzuerhalten? Als Journalist, wie sehen Sie denn, was jetzt eine Frage im Interesse der nationalen Sicherheit ist oder nicht? Sind Sie denn kompetent genug, um das zu sagen? Sie sind jetzt nicht mehr beim Guardian, aber sind Sie denn kompetent und kundig genug, um einen solchen Beschluss zu fassen?
So part of freedom of the press, an important part of freedom of the press that we've been talking about this morning is that fortunately journalists don't have to answer to government officials about what their sources gave them or how it is that they got the material. They are allowed to protect their sources and to protect their journalistic material from invasions by questions from the government, like some of the ones that you've just asked. Mr. Snowden is the source for the reporting that we've done at The Guardian. Who specifically at The Guardian received the material and when they've received it, I think is not of anyone's concern. Mr. Snowden has been identified as the source because he wanted to be identified as the source. But beyond that, I'm not going to answer questions about exactly when we got the documents or who at The Guardian got the documents or when we decided to share them with one another. Those are our internal matters as journalists and as a newspaper, and it's not for the government to intervene in that process. As far as what the documents are about, I think I've been very clear about what the documents are about. When Mr. Snowden came to us, he said that he had a large number of documents. And if you think about it for a minute, and I think this is really crucial, he had a lot of choices in terms of what he could have done with those documents. He could have uploaded them all to the internet. He could have given them to an organization and asked that organization to disclose it all. He could have sold the documents to foreign intelligence services around the world and been very rich for the rest of his life. He didn't do any of that. He came to journalists that work with the largest and most respected news organizations in the world and asked us to be extremely judicious and careful in going through the material and publishing only that which is in the public interest to know, while not endangering any lives. And I think that everyone can see that we have adhered to those wishes. As far as whistleblower protections are concerned, I'm not really sure where you got the idea that there are protections for whistleblowers in the U.S. Constitution. That's simply untrue. And as far as whether there are protections for whistleblowers in the law, all you have to do is look at the fact that the Obama administration has actually prosecuted under espionage statutes more whistleblowers in the last 5 years than had been prosecuted in all of American history prior to President Obama becoming president. And as I discussed earlier, these mechanisms that exist within the U.S. government are designed to suppress this kind of information and not to enable the public to learn about it. And then finally, as in terms of the question of how I as a journalist make these decisions, the simple answer is I make them the same way that journalists around the world make these kind of decisions every single day. I work with the largest newspapers around the world, Le Monde in France, El Mundo in Spain, the biggest journalistic institutions in Brazil and Scandinavia, The Guardian, the New York Times and the Washington Post are going through the same process. We consult with experts, we meet with editors, we have a collaborative process, and we make certain that the information that we publish doesn't put anyone's life in danger, and nobody has suggested that the information we publish has done so, but that we do our job as journalists, which is to overcome the desire of politicians to suppress this information and to demonize those people who bring it to light, and make sure that people can know what their governments are doing, because that's what democracy requires.
Thank you.
Dankeschön. Damit hat Frau Gomez im Namen des Auswärtigen Ausschusses das Wort, und dann gibt es noch 2 weitere Wortmeldungen im Anschluss. Frau Gomez für 2 Minuten. Herr Greenwald, haben Sie denn Hinweise darauf hin, dass europäische Politiker von der NSA ausgespäht wurden, auch erpresst worden ist oder erpresst werden könnte oder eingeschüchtert werden könnte? Meine zweite Frage an Sie wäre nun folgende. Als wir die Vereinigten Staaten vor kurzem besucht haben, haben wir festgestellt, dass sie überhaupt keine Strategie hatten, um mit der Situation umzugehen und diese zu bewältigen. Und gleichzeitig haben sie auch nicht die Verantwortung dafür getragen, weil es ja diese Spielchen gab, ja, der Präsident war nicht im Bilde, und dann war auch die Stimmung im Kongress nicht sehr gut und abwehrend. Was bedeutet dies nun? Was blüht uns denn noch? Wird denn noch gesagt werden, dass die NSA auch den amerikanischen Präsidenten ausgespäht hat? Und dann gab es eine Bezugnahme auf die Zusammenarbeit von Geheimdiensten und mangelnde Einhaltung von Grundsätzen und von rechtlichen Grundsätzen. Ich hätte da gerne gewusst, Sie haben ein paar erwähnt, Zusammenarbeit mit dem NSA. Ich hätte gerne gewusst, wie es mit Portugal aussieht. Und wenn Sie jetzt keine Antwort darauf geben können, vielleicht später dann irgendwann mal.
Mr. Greenwald.
Sure. As I've indicated, I'm hesitant to talk about the documents that we haven't yet reported, just because it's irresponsible for me to just start opining on documents that haven't gone through the journalistic process. And so what I will say is that there are still a lot of stories about how the NSA uses and abuses its surveillance power, that are not yet reported, but that we are working on. As far as the question of blackmail is concerned, again, I would simply point to history as opposed to what documents might reveal that we haven't yet reported, in which surveillance powers have been abused exactly that way in all sorts of cases. And I think it would be quite naive to assume that suddenly, for the first time in human history, a massive surveillance state that operates in the dark isn't being used for those purposes. As far as Portugal is concerned, there's still lots of countries where we intend to do very specific reporting in partnership with media organizations in those countries, and Portugal is one of them. So the only thing I can really say on that is that there is reporting coming regarding Portugal, and unfortunately, since we haven't done the reporting, I'm not able to be more specific.
Thank you. Then I have 2
Dankeschön. Dann gibt es noch 2 abschließende Fragen an Sie, Frau Romero-Lopez und Herr Engström. Ja, danke schön, Herr Greenwald. Ich danke Ihnen für diese Arbeit. Dadurch haben wir wirklich die Welt entdeckt, in der wir leben. Und das war doch sehr nützlich. Ich hätte nun gerne Folgendes gefragt. Glauben Sie denn, dass die Metadaten heikle Daten sind, sensible Daten sind? Denn wir haben mit den europäischen Experten darüber gesprochen und die haben uns bestätigt, dass Metadaten tatsächlich anhand einer einstelligen Ortung dazu leiten, dass jemand identifiziert werden kann. Wenn jetzt die Metadaten heikle Daten und sensible Daten sind, glauben Sie denn, dass sie geschützt werden sollten? In Ihrem Land, im Vereinigten Königreich, sind denn die Metadaten da geschützt? Der Standpunkt des Vereinigten Königreichs ist da sehr wichtig. Glauben Sie denn, dass man jetzt versucht, diese Metadaten zu schützen?
Mr. Greenwald.
Yeah, I talked earlier about why I actually think that the mass collection of metadata is more invasive than even the interception of content, the ability to read people's emails or listening to their telephone calls. And the court decision that we talked about earlier that came out in the United States that found that the NSA's metadata program violated the privacy rights of Americans is extremely compelling about why metadata is so invasive. And I really would encourage you to read it. And what the judge essentially said was that the idea that metadata is simply a list of relatively harmless information is really antiquated. It's from an era where communications were radically different than they are now. Given technology and what we use our phones for and what governments have been able to do in terms of analyzing metadata, metadata really is what the focal point of these surveillance agencies is, because they learn more about metadata, about people from metadata analysis than they do about content interception. And I'm glad you brought up the UK, because when it comes to European metadata, the NSA plays a very important role, but it is the UK through their interception of underwater fiber optic cables and their invasion into all sorts of systems, including by very controversial means of hacking, as Der Spiegel has reported, that is a primary threat to the privacy of European citizens when it comes to their telephone and email communications, at least as much, if not more so, than the NSA.
Thank you. The last speaker.
Schön. Der letzte Redner ist Herr Engström. Bitte schön. Danke. Ich komme aus Schweden und Sie wissen, dass das schwedische Fernsehen letzte Woche ein Programm ausgestrahlt hat. Da waren Sie einer der Journalisten und die schwedische Geheimdienstagentur FRA ist ja auch sehr eng mit der NSA verknüpft. Das wurde da gezeigt und sie spielen auch eine aktive Rolle bei dem Einbruch in Computersysteme. Und das war wirklich eine große Enthüllung, die viele in Schweden geschockiert hat. Und ich freue mich, Ihnen sagen zu können, dass dies doch sehr große Aufmerksamkeit in Schweden geschaffen hat. Und die Regierung sagt jetzt, sie hoffen, dass sich alle da an die Gesetze gehalten haben. Der Rechtsvorschrift, man hat den Eindruck, wenn es nun weitere Enthüllungen geben sollte, dass sie sich dann distanzieren werden und die Schuld auf die Sicherheitsagentur schieben werden. Meine Frage an Sie wäre nun folgende. Wird es denn noch mehr über die FRA geben, über diese Agentur? Und ganz allgemein, gibt es denn mehr Berichterstattung über die Einbeziehung von europäischen Regierungen? Das ist ja auch ein sehr interessantes Thema. Und dann meine allerletzte Frage. Sie erwähnten, dass eben nicht einzelne Leben gefährdet werden sollten. Kann ich denn zuversichtlich sein, dass Sie sich auch Gedanken machen über Ihre eigene Sicherheit und die Sicherheit von all denjenigen, die Zugang zu diesem Material bekommen haben? Dass es da gar keine theoretische Option für die Sicherheitsdienste gibt, dieses Material praktisch aus der Welt zu schaffen, indem Sie ermordet werden?
Yes. So, thank you for that concern, first of all. I'm glad you asked about the Swedish television report, because it leads to a point I wanted to emphasize, which is we spent a long time talking about metadata this morning. But one of the revelations that are reporting in Sweden demonstrated was that the spying, including mass indiscriminate spying, goes far beyond metadata. One of the reports that we did in Sweden was about the program X-Keyscore, which is a very important program for the NSA and the GCHQ. But they also have now started to allow their closest surveillance partners, such as Sweden, access to this program. And this program has nothing to do or very little to do with metadata. It's about the ability to store emails and read them at will, to collect people's browsing histories, their chat logs, and their Google searches, essentially the content of communications of what is being done on the internet as well. That is very much a part of how privacy is being invaded. It is not just metadata. There are programs, including PRISM, that are all about content and not just metadata. As far as European governments are concerned, it is true, and this was part of how the story evolved, that governments in Germany and France expressed indignation when we did our first reports that the NSA was targeting their countries, only for it to turn out that those countries subject their own populations to similar types of surveillance and even cooperate with the NSA. But at the same time, nobody really competes, certainly not in Europe, with the NSA and the GCHQ when it comes to the level of invasiveness, the amount of resources that go into it, and the objective and the mission to collect all forms of electronic communication. So it is true that a lot of our reporting has been about European governments, and that will continue. But the US and the UK really are on a different level when it comes to both their ability to destroy privacy and their desire to do so. And then finally, about my own security and the security of the people reporting on this, we've definitely taken a lot of steps to ensure that there are multiple copies of these documents in various places around the world, very safe and very secure, but that eliminating somebody's ability to work on them would not in any way impede the ability to do the reporting. Reporting on these materials is inevitable. I've been particularly fortunate to be in a country, Brazil, whose government is very appreciative of this reporting and who understands the need to support and protect a free press from the assault by the US and the UK on our ability to do the reporting. And so I think we all feel as confident as we can that this reporting is going to happen and that nobody can stop it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Allerbesten Dank. Damit haben wir die Rednerliste abgearbeitet. Im Namen unseres Ausschusses danken wir Ihnen sehr für Ihre Zeit und Ihre Bereitschaft, auf unsere Fragen zu antworten. Ich nehme an, dass jetzt alle ganz gespannt auf weitere Veröffentlichungen warten, insbesondere zum Thema, das Sie erwähnt haben. Da konnten Sie nicht die Fragen beantworten, das wurde nicht veröffentlicht. Meine allerletzte Bemerkung wäre, dass etwas, was eine Demokratie von einer autoritären Regime abhebt, sind, dass wir Geheimdienste zwar haben, aber auch demokratische Kontrolle. Und die freie Presse spielt eine wichtige Rolle. Denn es gibt auch die parlamentarische Kontrolle. Wir sind der Ansicht, dass wir als Europäisches Parlament doch nur sehr beschränkte Mittel haben, um diese Kontrolle auszuüben. Wir tun unser Möglichstes, aber wir sind natürlich sehr dankbar für jegliche Information. Sollten Sie sich da bemüht fühlen, diese Informationen zu teilen, da hätten wir großes Interesse dran. Also allerbesten Dank für Ihre Zeit und damit schließen wir dieses Panel ab.